All right, welcome back to episode 10. Today we're going to be summarizing kind of where we're at up to this point. So if you have not yet gotten a chance to watch all of our episodes, please don't let this be a summary per se. Go watch the other 9 because there's a whole lot more detail. But I do want to summarize where we're at up to this point, up to now, in our analysis of Sabbath. So we have talked about there's no scriptural basis for mandatory Sabbath observance, despite the fact that denominations like the Seventh-day Adventist Church believe that to be the case, whether from the claim that it's a creation ordinance that we went through, or from an appeal to the law of Moses. Any kind of an attempt to establish Sabbath keeping as a binding obligation, it fails both exegetically and it fails theologically. Now, I want to just remind you a couple of individuals that we looked at. D.R. Lee Lacey, okay? D.R. Lee Lacey, which is a scholar from Ridley Hall in Cambridge. He provides a very comprehensive summary of the law's function and applicability today. And this is what he says. This is from the book edited by D.A. Carson, From Sabbath to Lord's Day. He says, the law presents mankind with the ethical standards of the Holy God. As such, its goodness is unquestionable, but its effect is simply to demonstrate the existence of our sin, to condemn us as a result, and also to provoke our sin because of the weakness of the flesh. It can have no other effect on us, whether we read it as righteous demands or only death with Christ will remove us from the condemnation that it would otherwise constantly pronounce on anyone who endeavors to live by its standards. Furthermore, we also talked about where De Lacy affirms that the entire covenantal system established at Sinai has been replaced by the new covenant. I hope this isn't new by now. He states this: any attempt, even by Christians, to use the law as a basis for a standing before God led inevitably to the sin of boasting, that is, faith in self rather than faith in God. The only Christian way to fulfill one's obligation to God is by fulfilling the law of love, the law of subordinating one's own self to the other, by walking in the Spirit. These two factors, love and the Spirit, Paul sees as keeping Christian obedience from degenerating into formal legalism. So Christian obedience is found not in any kind of an adherence to the Mosaic Law, but in following the law of love and walking according to the Spirit. And doing that is going to safeguard us against any kind of legalism. Now, there's another professor that we looked at, David A. Dorsey, which is a professor at Evangelical School of Theology, who also addresses the role of the law of Moses in the life of a Christian. So what is the role? What is the purpose? What is the function of the law of Moses in the life of Christians? He highlights the inherent inconsistency in the way some believers attempt to determine which parts of the law are going to apply. Many uphold, and this is actually the Seventh-day Adventist position, many uphold the Ten Commandments as eternally binding, but then they modify or they adjust certain parts of the law. Now, Seventh-day Adventists don't modify the fourth commandment regarding the Sabbath. In fact, they double down on that particular fourth commandment. Well, you wouldn't commit adultery, would you? Well, then why is it okay for you to say you wouldn't want to commit adultery, but you don't keep the Sabbath? Other groups insist that certain moral laws, such as the prohibition against homosexuality that we find specifically in Leviticus. Here we see Leviticus 20, verse 11. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Now, many will look at certain moral laws such as this, okay? These are still applicable while simultaneously rejecting other laws such as dietary laws. Now, even if an individual says this is still something we need to abide by and this is morally binding, well, people often say, well, that doesn't mean that we can go out and kill the people that do this very thing, does it? Likewise, some are going to use Deuteronomy 22:5, for example. A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. So some are going to argue that this verse, okay, they're going to use this verse to argue against women wearing certain types of clothing, but they don't apply other regulations from that same exact chapter, such as the commands to build parapets on roofs or the prohibition against planting different seeds together. So the point of this, and me pointing this out, this inconsistent approach demonstrates the difficulty of arbitrarily selecting which aspects of the Mosaic Law remain in effect. Dorsey ultimately concludes that none of the 613 commandments of the Mosaic Law are legally binding on New Testament believers. I concur with him, including those traditionally categorized as moral law, the Decalogue. However, he does assert that all 613 laws remain significant in a revelatory and pedagogical sense. That's a big word. The New Testament affirms that Christ's covenant is distinct from the Sinaitic covenant. How do we know this? Well, we know because the author of Hebrews talks about this. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. This is a superior covenant. The author of Hebrews goes on. The Old Testament has been rendered obsolete. In speaking of a new covenant that Jesus enacts, he makes the first covenant obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The vast majority of its regulations are simply inapplicable when we look at the Old Covenant to the Christian today. And it's interesting because the specificity of the Mosaic Law to Israel is evident in its cultural and its geographical requirements, making it completely unsuitable as the governing rule for the church. I want to make a response to my Seventh-day Adventist keeping friends, my covenant friends. I used to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And so in response to Seventh-day Adventist covenant theology and their claims that the moral law of the Mosaic Law is still binding and required, not only do I agree with these, but Dorsey presents three reasons why this view is inconsistent with New Testament teaching. And I concur. There's three reasons that this is extremely inconsistent. The first one, the tripartite division, separating and dividing the law, is completely unbiblical. The division of the law into moral, ceremonial, civil categories is absent from both Scripture and early rabbinic traditions. The New Testament consistently treats the Mosaic Law as a single, unified system. Paul explicitly states that anyone who seeks to keep part of the law is obligated to all of it. He says that very clearly when you look at Galatians 5:3. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. If you keep any part of the ceremony, any part of certain aspects of it, Paul is going to argue that you must keep it all. And James declares that breaking one commandment makes a person guilty of violating the entire law. James 2:10. So the New Testament nowhere suggests that only portions of the law remain in effect, while no others, no, those are gone, but no, these remain in effect. That is not a biblical perspective. The second category, all laws contain moral elements. The distinction between moral and ceremonial laws is arbitrary because all laws reflect moral principles in some fashion, in some form. For instance, the laws regarding the Sabbath, agricultural practices, clothing regulations, all of those contain ethical considerations. Now, conversely, though, even laws classified as moral have cultural and time-bound elements to them, and especially the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not only can be seen as having some sort of moral principle to it, but it has a ceremonial principle to it because of the rituals that took place in order to keep it holy in the Old Testament. The third one, the attempt to preserve certain laws is absolutely unnecessary. This desire to retain portions of the Mosaic Law for Christian living, it overlooks the fact that all moral principles are reaffirmed under the law of Christ. All of them are. This is a better covenant, friends. The New Testament provides very clear ethical instructions without requiring some sort of adherence to the old Mosaic Law. It's almost like some of us, we are out of, we're exiting out of Egypt, and yet we want to go back. We want to go back to the meat pots of the Egyptians. This is a better covenant, friends. It's a better relationship because of Christ. Now, Dorsey proposes a solution that acknowledges that while the Mosaic Law is no longer legally binding, all 613 laws still hold some sort of significant value for instruction. It can be valuable for theological insight, maybe even for personal growth. And this absolutely affirms what is stated, what Paul states in 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. All Scripture is breathed out by God and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete and equipped for every good work. The law of Moses, while it's not a rule, it's not obligatory, it's not a rule of life for believers. It shouldn't be seen as that. It can provide a wealth of wisdom and insight into God's character and ways. but to interpret the law of Moses properly. I'm going to argue, along with Dorsey, who outlines a more God-centered biblical interpretation approach for applying Old Testament law, regardless of whether it is classified as ceremonial, judicial, or even moral. Look at these four areas that can help all of us kind of get a better glimpse at how to use Old Testament law properly. The first one, recognize that the law was given to Israel. The Mosaic Law was part of God's covenant with ancient Israel. It's not part of the covenant with the church. Christians shouldn't read it as an observer, or Christians rather should read it as an observer rather than as one under its authority. Number two, determine the original meaning and purpose. Like understanding why God gave a particular command is going to help in drawing theological and ethical insights from it. Number three, identify the theological significance. The Mosaic Law reveals important truths about God's character and his expectations for his people. So we have to identify that in context. And then number four, apply its principles to New Testament living. While the Mosaic commands are not binding, they're not obligatory, the principles behind them can inform Christian ethics and help us in our spiritual growth. Now, as we conclude this part of this deep dive, again, there is no scriptural basis for maintaining the Sabbath as a binding commandment, nor is there a valid reason to selectively retain portions of the Mosaic Law while discarding others. The entire law of Moses has been set aside in favor for a better, a far more superior new covenant. And believers are now governed by the law of Christ. Any kind of attempt to categorize and preserve certain Mosaic laws, it just simply fails to recognize the unified nature of the Jewish law and the New Testament's clear teaching that it's been rendered inoperative. It has no function for us as it relates to the new covenant. Instead of living under a modified version of the Mosaic system, believers should be walking in the Spirit and follow the law of love, which fulfills all of God's requirements. We know this to be true in Romans 13, 8-10. Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves one another has fulfilled the law. For the commandments, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandments are summed up. Any other, including the Sabbath, friends. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. And we will finish with this verse. Galatians 5:14, Paul says again, for the whole law, all of it, every bit of the law is fulfilled in one word. You shall love your neighbors as yourself. That's the law of Christ. Let's live in it. Let's be in the Spirit. Let's walk according to the Spirit as Christians that are under the law of Christ.